said earlier, our next speaker, Jim Regimbal, many of you have already heard him speak at previous meetings and conferences. He's been providing penetrating, comprehensive, timely budget analysis for some 35 years. He's been on his own doing at Fiscal analytics for the past 20 years. I've known Jim for 25 years as a friend and colleague from our days on the Senate Finance Committee. I asked Jim to provide a short bio, which he did. He provided me with 3 terse paragraphs and his picture in case I forgot what he looked like. And if anybody can help me find him right now, then we can start. Oh, there he is. That's a good picture.
Good morning, folks. So you have the pleasure of listening to someone again about the state budget. I thought Joe did a great job. He was very articulate, and I'm a little nervous about coming after him because I really did think he did a good job about explaining the governor and the administration rationale in terms of why they put out the introduced budget they did. And it's a very legitimate rationale, I thought, that he talked about. He put it out in a neutral manner. So I thought Joe did a great job, and I'm going to give you a somewhat different twist on things. But we agree on pretty much everything, but really going to take a look at it from more of the local perspective. And to do that, I need to go back and talk about the revenues again. Joe did a good job. He talked about the economics of it, where we are, and some of the risks going forward, trying to forecast revenues. In fact, this morning I was over at the VASS, Virginia Associated School Superintendents Conference, and Senator Barker was there and made a point about how revenues over the last dozen years or so have just been bouncing around, up and down, 7-8%. One year it's negative something, the other year it's way positive, and trying to plan is very difficult. You know the risks out there. We've got trade issues. The economy looks strong to me. My personal opinion about the economy is that we're going to be okay for the next year and maybe even the next 2 years. We had a strong jobs report. The consumer's 70% of our economy. The consumer's strong right now. Now there are some signs, raising interest rates, housing market is not doing as well, although autos, are better than people thought they were. Still 17 million. So some of the interest-sensitive indicators are really what causes recessions, and they're a little shaky, but the consumer's pretty strong. So I'm still pretty confident about revenues coming in good this year, and even next year we're pretty conservative in our forecast. So the way we're building this budget right now is looking reasonable to me. But I look at this year as a rare opportunity for our state policymakers. How many times, in the last 30 years, 35 years I've been doing this, during a mid-cycle budget amendment year, like we're in this year, we have $2.2 billion available to work with. Now, you can work with that and hold up a bunch of different ways, and the governor did in a reasonable manner. We had a surplus of over $500 million last year. The Water Quality Improvement Fund got $73 million. The rest went into reserve, but that's a choice. Remember now, when I say that these are choices, the General Assembly still has the ability to change those choices, because that budget has not been adopted yet. The economic forecast is really $546 million, $48 million. That's what they're forecasting the economy outside of the new tax policy that the federal government put in that's affecting us, the Wayfair decision. That's just pure economics. And you can see they're forecasting growth of 3% this year and 3.7% next year. That's reasonable in a 2% inflation, era. That's just reasonable, real growth. Then you have the tax conformity and the Wayfair money. And so you add that in, and you net out the governor's proposal for the refundable earned income tax credit of $216 million and a couple other things, and that's what gets you this almost $2 billion in revenue that the General Assembly and the governor have to work with for this biennium, an additional revenue. Right now, because we had this surplus in 2018, that bumped up our base. We only needed 1.4% revenue growth to meet the fiscal 19, the current year we're in, because of that surplus. We didn't need a whole lot of growth. Right now, we've got 3.4%. I think we're going to do a lot better. We haven't changed our withholding in Virginia. We had the federal tax changes. We haven't changed our withholding tables in Virginia. What's going to happen this spring when people file their taxes, they're going to have to pay more taxes because of the federal changes, unless there's changes in the General Assembly. And we're going to see that money, something has to happen in the spring when people file their income taxes. So it doesn't reflect those changes. And so that's real sort of growth, that's 3.4%. In fact, I like to look at, you've probably seen this before, withholding is 2/3 of our general fund revenue, income tax withholding out of payrolls. And it's growing on a 12-month moving average. Look at, this goes way back to, you probably can't see it, back to 2008. You see the Great Recession there, where it really dipped, right here. You see the sequestration in 2013, how it affected Virginia. The slowdown in defense spending, occurred. We had this really up and down revenue growth I talked about. But we've been improving steadily over the last 2 years. We're at 5% 12-month moving average withholding. That's real-time money in the bank. Reflects people being employed, how much they're being paid. It's a great coincident indicator of Virginia's economy. And it's looking pretty good right now. 5%. Whoops, I'm backwards. So, you've got the economic growth. That's pretty conservative. In fact, I want to make another comment. We've got a collar on non-withholding. That's about 16% on average of general funds. That's the estimated payments that people have their own businesses. That's capital gains that gets paid, quarterly, and then you settle up at the end of the year. That's about 16%. In some years, it's a lot more. And we're going to get probably more estimated payments and final tax returns from non-withholding this spring because people were selling, a lot of stock market gains. Businesses have been pretty good. But we've got a cap on that because we don't want to, we've made a decision in the state to not forecast above our 10-year average amount because it's considered one time. They don't want to put it into operating spending, but it still shows up. And really the forecast for that's not in the budget is $200 million. $200 million. So the likelihood, it doesn't mean it's going to happen, but the likelihood, if the forecast is right, we're going to have at least a surplus of $200 million, even if everything else here works out. And that's not even in the introduced budget, that $200 million surplus. So the thought process is the next year, the year after, we may get less than 16% they don't want to spend. But so it actually could be higher. Joe showed you this chart. And this is the current year. This is where you get the individual business provision changes. There's something Joe didn't mention, though, and that is really the business is permanent. And look at how that grows. The current law on the federal level is permanent for business changes. And that grows to a very substantial amount. And so there's an opportunity to give it back to businesses. In fact, Delegate Peace has a proposal to cut the corporate income tax to 1%. Put a bill in, because he wants to give some of that business money back, that line right here. But there's an opportunity that we have as a state to say, we're going to have more responsibility, the federal government's going to devolve more, we need to improve our education, that helps businesses, we need to maybe improve our transportation system, maybe we should keep and use some of that extra business revenue, because at the federal level, those businesses are going to save a lot of money, so in total, they're not paying more. And the state's and locals are going to have more responsibility placed on them. That's what I'm talking about, thinking about choices here. This is a year of choices. How many times do we get those kinds of choices? I haven't seen very many. That we have this kind of money on the table, that we can make some real choices. And you, as the audience, talk to your legislators who are going to be making these choices. Here's an opportunity to do some things that we need to restore, that we have not restored from the Great Recession. The next piece is not as big. Joe again talked about this, it has a similar table. This is a little more detailed. Yes, it shows you how the transportation money is allocated. The sales tax formula regardless of whether it's internet or brick and mortar, goes through a formula. And so we've heard discussion of maybe using extra revenue. This is the point I want to make for school construction. Joe pointed this out as well. We already allocated this money set for this top line up here. And really, a lot of it goes back to localities through the school-age population distribution or the SOQ formula, or your 1% local option, which you all have, or the regional taxes in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, and even the new historic Triangle Williamsburg tax. So it's already flowing. You guys aren't going to want to change those formulas. It's being used for transportation, for education already. So you're not going to divert one piece of education to another piece of education. At least I don't think you want to do that. So really what's left to maybe allocate would be this $55 million up here that's unrestricted. Now it obviously goes into the general fund and it's used. In fact, you could make the argument that 1/3 of the general fund goes to public ed, so in reality, really even 1/3 of this goes to education in a sense. So there really isn't a lot there to support, let's say, a school construction debt issuance. Well, the school's out of this wafer, even if that 155 is right, 155 million. That would only support a one-time debt issuance of about $600 million. And that's not a lot. I've got a slide here that says over the 5-year period from 2013 to 2017, localities spent $2.6 billion on school construction and renovation. So one time of $500 million that you have to support over 25 years, that revenue source you get at one time basically doesn't do a lot. So really, this doesn't solve the school construction problem, even if you could do it. So when you add this all together, you got the economic growth, you've got the tax conformity, let's call it, revenue coming in from the individual side, and the sales tax. What happens, it flows through, and you get not that 3.7% that was forecast, 3% that was forecast in 2019 from the economic growth. You throw in the tax revenues, the new tax revenue, you get 5.7 in the introduced bill. So that's the difference. You get that extra tax revenue. Here's a point I want to make about that. Anything in fiscal 19 above 4.1% general fund revenue growth. So let's say the General Assembly adopts the governor's plan. They don't put any new tax policy that gives money back, to the individuals, higher standard deduction, etc. But they adopt the governor's plan. You get 5.7% growth. Half of that above 4.1% has to go into the rainy day fund and can't be spent. Has to be reserved. In fact, their plan actually does that. Assumes that this money is going to be reserved, essentially, and that's part of that reserve number I'm going to show you. So we have a constitutional requirement that looks back 6 years about general fund revenue growth, and anything above the average 6-year general fund revenue growth has to go, half of it has to go into the rainy day fund. And that average 6-year revenue growth, previous 6 years before 19, is 4.1%. So it's a limitation on actually spending in operating support or one time, because it has to go into the rainy day fund. In total, so you add the surplus from last year, the balances, that unspent balances of 507, to the new revenue, economic tax reform revenue, you get 1.6. That's the new biennial revenue. Don't need to go into that. I wanted to spend a little time, because we have some time today, to talk about this tax reform, because I was over at the Virginia Association of School Superintendents yesterday and today. I did a presentation there, but I listened to Delegate Landis and Senator Barker, and they made it very clear, we all know this, that tax reform is going to be the first issue on the General Assembly's agenda. They have got to figure out how much money that the governors propose, but how much money the General Assembly is going to adopt, this revenue is going to be available. The likelihood is that they're going to have an enlarged tax bill that spends more back to the taxpayer than the $216 million the governor did. They're going to want to maybe increase the standard deduction. They're going to maybe want to do something on itemized deduction, allow people to take the federal standard deduction, which you can't do. What you can't do now is you can't take federal itemized and then go to a state standard or vice versa. You've got to do the same. If you do federal itemized, you've got to do state itemized. And I heard an interesting, Jessica at VML said something interesting, Delegate Sickles said, if we allow, here's an issue, for example, if we allow a taxpayer to take a federal standard deduction, which was raised up to $24,000, and then we allow them to take a Virginia itemized deduction, we don't have the ability, because we don't have this, we basically don't have this function in our state tax department to go out and audit people. How do we know those people are actually accurately telling us what their itemized deductions is? Right now, IRS, because you're having to do the same exact thing, you're taking federal itemized and IRS can go audit you, make sure you're doing the same thing at the state level, that you don't need those, you need IRS agents to make sure that's all on the up and up. And so if you allow that split, that's an interesting issue I hadn't thought about, that they're going to have to, because I've heard that proposal. In fact, the plan the Republican leadership announced has that in there, to allow people to do that, the split, what they're going to do. And that would help itemizers in Virginia, but there's some issues about administration concerning that. So, under current law, what's happened is because the federal government raised its standard deduction, and we have a much lower $6,000 standard still, many more people are going to, because federal taxes are so much higher than state, they're going to decide, it's going to find that it's more beneficial to them to go to that federal standard of $24,000 rather than itemized. They're also capped at $10,000. The biggest single itemized part of a tax return is state income taxes and local property taxes. That's now capped at the federal level at $10,000. And so many people are going to decide, well, I can only take $10,000. I don't have many more things to itemize. I'm just going to take the $24,000 standard deduction, forced into taking the state $6,000. So they're going to switch from taking a state itemized tax return to a state standard deduction, and that's going to cause them to have to pay more income taxes because they get less of a state deduction. They might have had $15,000 before in itemized deductions. Let's say you're in Fairfax, you pay you pay $12,000, $15,000 in property taxes easily. Well, you're capped at 10. You're going to go, okay, I'm going to take the state on the federal standard deduction at 24. I got to be forced into the state standard. There's 500,000 people under the way it's sitting right now, without changes in the General Assembly, they're going to switch. And that's where all that money was coming from in the main, on the individual side, in the main, that $500 million or so. Now, the impact, and this is what the General Assembly is going to be wrangling about. Who should get if we're going to do tax reform, who gets the money back? On the Virginia side, Virginia residents would pay $333 million more in state income taxes. Virginia residents. Non-residents have paid, that's not in here. Virginia residents. You notice that under the federal law, we had a company analyze what the impact would be on Virginia taxpayers. Well, the low-income folks, they're over 50% of the filers, but they pay only about 8 or 9% of the state income taxes. 50 pay 9%. Doesn't move a whole lot, actually, on the state side. You can see the relative share. They do pay a little bit more, 45 million or so more under this current system that we're going to have. There's no change. The bigger changes, obviously, are in the higher income people. You look at the people over 500,000. That's about 37,000 tax returns. It's about 3.7 million. They pay about 18% of the state taxes. Okay, and they, the relative share of them actually goes down. So they benefit a little bit relative. They pay a lot of the income. Their relative share goes down. But look at when you combine the state changes with the federal changes, and Joe talked about this, is $4 billion savings. So you subtract the $4 billion, you actually add increased taxes of $333 million. You get to 3.6 down here in net savings to taxpayers from the combined system. So there's still a lot of savings to people from the federal tax reductions. But look who pays more in relative terms, the upper income. They're actually paying more in a relative sense. But they're also getting all the the dollars too, still, because they pay the dollars. If that same 1%, there's a more progressive federal income tax than state. They pay 28%, that top one of this federal income taxes. So it depends how you look at this thing, you know, on how, yes, a lot of the dollars are going to the upper income, but they're paying the dollars. And they're actually getting less of the return back than they are. So there's multiple ways to look at this issue. So that's the revenue side, and that's going to be the tax policy issue confronting the General Assembly. Whether we're going to keep some of it, whether we're going to give more back. So that's sort of the budget choices that we have in front of them today, in this General Assembly. They have to fund mandatory items. Joe talked about the Medicaid under forecast, disallowance of some of the Medicaid spending at the geriatric hospital, the VITA settlement, and then you've got, you know, probably out of reserves, we've got to pay Micron some incentives that came to Manassas expand their facility. So there's some mandatory, there's probably some other ones in there as well that I didn't list. So that's one thing they have to do. The second thing is, how much do we reserve? That's a choice. There's nothing, there's no gun to our head other than keeping our AAA credit rating. That's kind of a gun. So we don't exactly know where that lies, though. We have rules we like to keep. We don't want to be above 5% of our transportation general fund revenues. We don't want our debt service to be above 5%. That's sort of a rule we have, an internal rule that Wall Street, we think Wall Street would accept to keep us a AAA credit rated state. So that's a choice we have to make. The third choice is tax policy, tax reform. Do we keep some, do we give it back, do we give it all back? Do we do it on one time for the individual side? You know, you might hear things about temporary credits. You know, do we sunset the individual changes at 2024 when they expire? You know, do we give back some business money? Do we keep it? There's a lot of moving parts here on the tax policy side. Next, we could budget some of this one-time money. So there's ideas there. For example, instead of doing reserves, direct reserves, we could increase our funding for the VRS teacher pool. We could put a slug of money into the VRS teacher pool, which would eventually lower rates to you because we're improving that unfunded liability. And Wall Street also likes to see our unfunded liabilities go down. They look at that too. So instead of putting in the bank a reserve, we could put a chunk into the teacher pool, which helps everyone over time. So that's a choice I haven't heard much about that we can make. We can use one-time money for capital rather than floating more debt. We have almost $5 billion authorized but unissued debt on the books. That's planned to be issued. It's been authorized. Planned. Instead of using debt, we could use cash for that, which saves us that 25, 30 years of debt service. We could, lastly, and I know you're interested in this, we could make some choices about restoring the cuts to K-12 that occurred in the last recession that have yet to be restored. And in fact, Senator Barker at the Bass Conference and Delegate Landis both talked about the support cap that was placed on our local school divisions that they're not paying these positions anymore. They're not in the SOQ. That was done in 2010. They could remove that or partially remove that. We have some money available right now to make these choices. Joe did a good job of going through this. I'm just going to go over this slide. K-12 out of this $2.2 billion almost got in general funds, got actually $160 million in general funds, plus another $70 million in lottery forecast, reforecast revenues up. Lottery to me is just like general funds. It's not technically, but it's like it. And so you got $230 million new K-12, net new K-12 funding to you out of that. It's actually more than 2 points because you got to add lottery money. It's closer to 2.3 billion in new money. And here's how you got teacher salaries bumped it to 5%. The literary fund money for school construction loans basically is funding an interest rate subsidy for projects that were already on a list going back 10 years that have never had enough money to pay for. And there's a list already out there, and they're basically localities that are the most hardship, that needed an interest rate subsidy the most. That's how you get on that literary fund list. And so this is not really going to be any new projects for that either. That's what they needed to fund those previously announced probably they never had enough money to fund. And then there's a little money for school counselors. They've raised the average add-on by 3 percentage points in 2019 and from 13% to 16% and then 14% to 16% the second year. So that's a fairly major increase, particularly for challenged schools that have lots of free lunch students. So that's interesting and very, for those localities that have lots of at-risk students, that's a good development for them, the government proposed. They also added money to the lottery itself. That lottery money, the other half of it, went to increasing your flexible lottery amount of money, and that can be used for school construction, additions, renovations, etc. It's a flexible use. And Delegate Landis actually mentioned that this morning again, that his preference would be to keep increasing the amounts of money for local localities in a flexible manner. So he likes that. He believes you like that as well. So that's one of his preferences. Other spending choices, Joe did a good job. They put a lot of money in natural resources. They really kicked that up through the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund. By the way, the question out there about how some of the administrative parts of that, in the past, it's been a 50% match, 50% local match to get that money. So that helps. There was also significant dollars put into commerce and trade. And then I don't have all the list of health and human services, so go to Joe's presentation for more of that. There was some interest rate savings on 50 million. Treasury interest, there was other things in here. It's probably best to go to his presentation and getting a lot of detail on that. He put this chart as well. The governor tried to give an idea of a long-term plan for the one-time individual side of the federal tax changes. And you can see the priorities of the governor were water quality, land comp, broadband. Delegate Landis actually mentioned that, which was interesting to me because I've heard members at higher levels take a more conservative track on broadband. Delegate Landis said actually he liked the broadband idea and really needed some help. In fact, Augusta County doesn't have broadband. So in fact, he said it's good for schools. Some of these schools don't have broadband. So that was interesting comment he made this morning on that. So those are kind of the major areas the governor laid out on a long-term basis. But remember, all this is very aspirational. In fact, this is being debated right now, let alone this in future General Assemblies. So very aspirational. But it was an interesting way to put it. I like to give you guys every year the actual dollar breakout of the budget. And this is balanced to the penny, and it shows you where the general funds have gone and how much they've increased. This one I showed you what they've increased against the last May's adopted budget. So take a look. In general funds, I mentioned this. The actual increase in biennial general funds for K-12 was $160 million. There were some net reductions of like over 50 because of less students. There was less students than last year's forecast, and so SOQ is paid on a per pupil basis. Because of less students than forecast, they were able to save $50 million. So yes, there's a lot of pluses, but you really only care about, in the main, the dollars that are coming to you. You still got to operate your schools the same way, regardless of whether you lost 20 students or not. You're basically going to have to run the same school division. So that's the total change, $160 million. You can see the reserve popping in here. Through the discretionary cash reserve they developed and the constitutional rainy day fund deposit. And that's based on last year's surplus. This 790 includes the reserved amount from their forecast in 2019 that actually doesn't have to be deposited in 2021, but they're going to reserve it, not spend it, because it has to go be deposited later. So if you take a look at your leisure. This chart I also like to give you, and this is how much of the general fund goes back to localities. About 3/4 goes back to localities of the general fund, aid the localities from the state for K-12. The rest of it is like CSBs, local social service staff, public safety like HB 599, aid to the sheriffs, jail per diems, constitutional officers, some transfers from the Department of Accounts, and then the car tax. And so as you can see, back in the sort of peak year right before the recession, fiscal '09, you got 52% of the general fund. You're getting 42% in this budget. 42%, 10 percentage points less. Part of the reason it went down is because a lot of it's being reserved. $1 billion is being reserved of that 2.2. It's still available for appropriations if we can put them to reserve. K-12 similar. Not as bad, 35 down to 29%. So that's the reality of what this change of the state budget over time has looked like for local governments. Now, Joe showed this. So we had that surplus last year, end of fiscal 18. That got counted in this $1 billion. Governor's introduced a bill, added another $500 million to it. So that's Joe's chart. 1.5 billion is the introduced bill reserve. Again, choice. The choice is, we think we need to do that for recession, for Wall Street, keeping our AAA credit rating, etc. But again, choice. I'd like to show you this chart as well too. This goes back to 2001, and it shows you the priorities that the state has had in its spending. Look at the bottom first. The average compound growth in general fund revenues from 01 through 19, the introduced bill, is 3.3%. That includes the recession, where we had negatives, and we had great years. The average is 3.3. Medicaid, 7.2%. And that really has nothing to do with Medicaid expansion. In fact, Medicaid expansion saves some money in the near term. This is just the growth in healthcare costs and utilization in the Medicaid program. And it's grown at a compound rate of 7.2. It's actually total dollars of $3.5 billion over that time of growth is more than the growth in the larger program of K-12 in total dollars. When you have that low of general fund revenue growth and that high of Medicaid growth, there's not much left for everything else. So that's one of the issues that we've had. That's why I say this is an unusual year. We've got more money. We've got some ability to make choices. This is what Medicaid looked like. This is the forecast, the average annual growth rates. It moderated a little bit. We expected a big moderation. They planned on managed care, moving way more to managed care to save money. It didn't turn out that way. This was the original forecast without expansion, without the expansion in it. It's actually less with the savings and expansion. This is what it is now in the bill, but that includes expansion. Without expansion, we're still at that 6 and 7% growth range, of Medicaid. So it really hasn't slowed down yet. And I don't think it will slow down much, because the over 85 population, where 60% of Medicaid expenditures are on long-term care facilities, much of that is elderly, is going to be the fastest growing segment of our population. It doubles between now and 2040. And a lot of those people will be in Medicare-funded facilities. How are we going to reduce our utilization of Medicaid? Maybe some. Joe's much more of an expert than I am at this, so you'd probably like to get him up here to have a comment on this. So, K-12 changes last year. Just want to start with a slide about spending. Re-benchmarking, think of re-benchmarking as funding inflation. That's essentially what it does. It funds inflation. It actually lags because it looks back a few years, but it funds inflation. Everything else below that top line, last in the adopted May budget, is really above inflation, but it's not a whole lot. It's not a whole lot when we talk about nearly $7 billion in state aid for K-12. We talk about a few $100 million, it's not a lot. So you can start looking at sort of the canaries in the coal mine about not a lot of K-12 in relative terms. So we did pretty well up to that peak year of 09. We raised taxes in 2005, the sales tax at 0.5%, cigarette taxes, etc. $11,000 increase in state in teacher salaries, average teacher salaries, from over that 7 years, 02 to 09. In the 7 years, 9 to 17, it was only $4,000. In fact, if it grew at the rate of inflation, teacher salaries in 17, it would have been $62,000. So teacher salaries have not grown even at the rate of inflation. So kudos to the governor recognizing that, putting that in, although we know the other side is that you have to fund a good chunk, in fact, more than half is funded by localities of this. So that's the other side of it. Now look at teacher salaries compared to the rest of the country. And Northern Virginia is actually like Maryland. Northern Virginia Planning District 8, about 70,000 is our average teacher salary up there. But we don't show up on the total state on the first page. Our cost of living, I use the proxy of home values as a proxy for cost of living. Cost of living is on that first page in Virginia. But our teacher salaries show up here at 32nd, about 53,000. And if you took out Planning District 8, 70, we would be in the bottom 5 states. We would be 47,000. And so there is a dichotomy there too. Northern Virginia rest, it's a fairly big dichotomy. This chart shows you the state-funded teacher salaries all the way back to 1996. And if you look at since the recession, we've had 5 state-funded teacher salary increases in the last 12 years. 5. And when you look at the start date, the effective date, the effective increase is up until this last one is 2% or less. So goes back to the previous slide, there is an issue on teacher salaries. And Del DeLandis even talked about today, this morning, he said, we used to get a lot of teachers from Pennsylvania. They produced more teachers than they could use. They'd come to Virginia. And now they're going other places because they pay better in other places. They aren't coming to, so we're having a teacher about attracting people into the teaching profession. On VRS, in the last recession in particular, even before that and after, we didn't fund the required actuarial rates to fully fund our teacher plan. And that's why we have an unfunded liability. We only funded about 75% right now. If we would have funded the rates and what was required to keep it fully funded, that is the blue line. The red line is what was actually funded, the rate. If we would have funded this blue line, we would now have the dotted blue line. Okay, instead of doing that red line, we had done the blue line, we'd have this dotted blue line, and we would have a rate of about 11% instead of 16. So that's the consequence of underfunding. You know, you save in the early years, but you pay, and you keep paying, and it's harder to get back, those lower rates. This chart shows you the per pupil state aid to K-12, all funds, lottery, and also includes the stimulus money from the federal government in 10 and 11, because that was appropriated through the State Appropriation Act. So all appropriated state funds are in this per pupil. That's the blue line. We're growing. The peak year was 09 until 17. We caught up in nominal dollars. We're now well above that. But if you take just inflation out, inflation's been pretty low. If you take the CPI, that's all I used, Consumer Price Index. I didn't even try to get more sophisticated. I just took the CPI. We're $374 per pupil in real dollars less than we were in 09. And so that would cost the state about $500 million today per year to get us back to 09 in real terms. 500 million. The consequence of that, keep our school divisions funded, localities have had to increase from 48.6 in that peak year to 51.3 in 17, the latest data I have. So you've had to step up to the plate. Keep it funded. You fund a greater share of the system now than you used to. Kind of goes with everything else I've been saying. Makes complete sense. Well, the problem is, for you guys, is that your main tax source, which is half of your revenues, is the real estate tax. On average, half, some more, some less, but on average, half. The income tax is actually 2/3 of the general fund. You can see which has grown better. And this is through 17, because that's the latest I had for all localities. That comparative report doesn't come out until after the session's over. You only grew 20% total from 09 to 17. Individual income tax, yeah, dipped, in 10, and you stayed flat, but they've grown much more rapidly. So their main revenue source has grown more rapidly. Now they've had to pay Medicaid. So you have got to keep that in mind. But you had to raise your taxes. The median tax rate in cities is 17 cents higher than 09. The median tax rate in counties is 12 cents higher. Towns, you're the outlier. You're the same. You're actually, the median tax rate's exactly the same. So it didn't go up. But cities and counties, you've had to raise it significantly to get your 20% growth. So it's not just economic growth, that's tax increase growth too, at 20%. So let's look at school construction. I mentioned this chart from 13 to 17, there was 2.6 billion in construction and renovation and addition money spent by localities. It's a lot of money, so it's a big issue. And my suspicion is that that was relatively subdued from what obviously needs to be done because your finances weren't in that great a shape. So you couldn't afford to do more. So, you know, if finances were better, that would be a lot higher. There's a lot of needs out there for renovation and construction. But it's just good to know, for me it was good to know what the magnitude of this issue is. So if you wanted to use extra Wayfair money of $50 million for $500 million and it's paid for 25 years, it doesn't do much. It's got to be a lot bigger issue than that. Expanding the literary fund by 80 million for an inch doesn't do much for this. I mean, this is a huge issue. Really, the issue becomes you need more money so you can float your own debt in the main. There's some exceptions, but if you had a lot more money, the state gave you $500 million more, I guarantee you would have more capacity to float your own debt and pay your debt service. So it's really just a money issue for localities, in my opinion. Some localities, Richmond, has a debt capacity issue problem. They don't have a lot of debt capacity, but in the main, it's really money to pay debt service, I think. Tell me if I'm wrong about that.
You're not for us, a $28 million school, you're talking about 1.7 million.
Right.
Then you're talking about an additional $2 million operating, and one penny is $206,000.
Right. So, right. It's a money issue to fund the debt service for that new school. And if you had, like I said, if they got you back to 09 even, you know, and spread that out, that'd be significant. And a lot more people could float debt and renovate and build schools. So it becomes just a money issue. Back in 99, 2000, this was an issue back then. The state actually appropriated money, $55 million a year. Didn't last long because we hit a recession in 02. So it got cut in half, and it lasted at $27.5 million until the next recession hit, and then it just got eliminated. So there was, for a time, some money just appropriated by the state directly for school construction renovation. I want you to look at the formula. This is one of the issues. You know, politics is such that you got to satisfy everyone. So they took that money and they gave everyone $100,000. And then they said, okay, we're going to give the rest based on just pure numbers of pupils that you have. So you got everyone got a base of 100, and then the big localities got more, they had more students, but it wasn't really prioritization of who needs it, who doesn't, because it's difficult to do. That would be the issue again. Difficult to prioritize, you know, the distribution of money. That's the point I was trying to make there. The lottery proceeds flexible funding, really, there was a version of that earlier, but the new one started in 2017. It's up to about 40% of lottery funding, and that's about $600 million a year now. 40% of that goes to this flexible per pupil formula. It's purely per pupil, you know, multiplied by your composite index, and you get this money. Now, you can use it in any manner you want. The land is indicated you like that again. Of course, we know that, but I think you know, there'd be efforts to increase in some way that type of funding, whether it's lottery or general funds. Now, just to kind of reiterate the debt side, why the state would have a hard time taking on a local school debt, you know, $2.6 billion or 5 years, you know, or more. This is what they spend their debt on. We're already bumped up on our capacity. We have this 5% of our total general fund blended revenues with transportation. You know, we've done a little better on the revenue side, so, you know, I'm showing you that bullet point down here. You know, we've got about $5 billion that we've already authorized on issue. That's going to be issued over the next few years. Again, we're going to be paying debt service on that. We're already up. That was by the way, go back to that chart I showed you, Medicaid 7.2. Guess what the second highest compound growth rate was in expenditures since 2001? Anyone remember that? This is a test here. What was the second highest? Debt service. So it's gone from 200 million to 735 million. And it's going to go higher because we've got unissued debt that we're going to issue. So the state, you know, taking on new debt, well, it's going to be tough. We do have this 600, they just came out with their new calculation of how much more capacity the state has to issue debt over the next 10 years. But we changed the way we do that a few years back. Instead of doing year by year, we said, okay, we're going to look at our revenues, and we're going to forecast them over the next 10 years, and we're going to see what we're going to average that capacity, you know, and say we have this amount, 671 million. But it's all most of it's back-loaded. We have basically zero capacity now if you just looked at it year by year. And then you get, as the years goes on, you start getting some. By 5 years from now, you get 500 million. 8 years, you get 900 million. And then they said, okay, we're just going to average that. Well, guess what? That doesn't take into account any recession. There's no recession forecast in that formula over the next 10 years. We just have this sort of, we're going to get 4% revenue with each and every year for 10 years, and we're going to count our debt capacity. We're going to say we've got 671 million based on this average over 10 years. To me, that's scary. So, my point is the state doesn't have a lot of capacity for new debt either. In fact, this chart dramatizes that. So we're the blue line. This is debt per person. State debt per person. And this comes right out of that Debt Capacity Advisory Committee report from the Treasury. We're the blue line. We're a AAA rated state. The other AAA rated states are here, the green line. They look a lot better. We're going up. This is the average state, the red line. We're way above them. That's why Joe says we need more reserves. That's one of those choices to keep our AAA, and why we were put on credit watch. So, Governor makes a good point. I want to point out one thing. This has gone to the General Assembly's in a resolution. This slide, you know, we haven't had our 09 cuts restored in K-12. State teacher pay isn't that great. A lot of the positions, only 2/3 of the actual positions in your schools are recognized by the SOQ. You pay 100% of the 1/3. That's why when they put out a teacher salary increase, really they're paying 40% of it or so. You're paying 60% because you got a lot of employees. You've got to pay 100% of that increase. So, and the ones with high composite index is a lot more. So, point I want to make here, there's different avenues, different choices. So, remember in 2016, the State Board of Education said, really we need to expand our SAQ by 600 million a year. We need to recognize more positions, guidance counselors, assistant principals. We need to get rid of the support cap. That added up to $600 million. The General Assembly never did that. The governor's proposing one small piece from the guidance counselors this year. Last year, I think there was a small piece proposed as well. But in the main, that $600 million has not even been proposed, let alone funded. Because the biggest one is the support cap, $350 million a year. Hasn't been proposed. It was brought up by Senator Barker and Delegate Landis today. They see the long-term need. I say the long-term is now, if we got some money. Start chipping away at that at least. That's some of the underfunding of K-12. Here's another way to do it. The General Assembly doesn't like to expand the SOQ, but give them credit and say instead of doing on average 55% of the SOQ that you define, do 58%, 59% of the SOQ. Don't change, you don't have to change, we just want money. Each point is 93 million. That's another way to do it. Give them credit. Hey, the state's paying for 60% of the school costs now. Yay, okay. So, you know, there's multiple ways to get at this, is what I'm saying. And maybe still get credit. School construction, one-time monies. We've got some one-time monies. School construction is one-time. So there's an opportunity. I can tell you, you have to put a lot of money in the literary fund, a lot, because it's an interest rate subsidy and starts with the school divisions that have the lowest capacity first. And so, let's say a city like Richmond is going to be pretty far down that list before they even get an interest rate subsidy on because they're considered wealthier. Whether they are or not, different story. Their composite is almost 0.5. Other budget needs, Joe did a great job. You know, CSB's mental health, big issue. I want to point out two of them actually. We always talk about HB 599 because they haven't kept pace with growth in the general fund. They are for the last 2 years, but prior to that, there was a whole slew of years, and we haven't even gotten back to what they paid before the recession. You know, about 200 million. We're just getting close to that now, in what HB 598 the police is. The one I highlighted, inadequate highway public transportation funding, and I'm going to talk about that in some detail. I'm not going to go over, we're probably getting close, right? So I'm going to go to transportation. So transportation, we raised our taxes in 2013. We actually kept the motor fuel tax pretty much the same. They were hoping some internet money didn't happen. They kind of kept the motor fuel. They raised the motor vehicle sales and use tax, and they gave money to the regions, Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia. That was the primary tax increases to transportation. But look at here. So it was phased in. So you see the bump from in 14, 15, and a little bit in 16. But we're now back to here. Okay. In fact, this has gone down. I should have changed this because the latest forecast came out a couple weeks ago for the biennium down $61 million in state transportation revenue forecast. So it's actually worse than that. So we're down to flat again in growth. Think about the revenue sources. You know, sales tax is probably the best one right now. But motor fuel, it's a declining revenue source. Motor vehicle sales, it's up and down. Really, they're not really great sources that grow with the economy, the general economy, and the use of our transportation system. Now look at this chart. Since 2013, where they put the money in, we had a maintenance problem. That's where all the pressures really came from. Even though we have all these needs for new construction, we weren't maintaining our system. So maintenance had to grow, and it grew the most versus construction. 19% versus 7% since we raised our taxes. Okay, we're still not maintaining our secondary roads. That a lot of people say to me. I was at a VACO meeting in Louisa County, was complaining about their secondary roads not being maintained. So, still a problem, still a point out there. Well, look at the growth of total revenues in the 6-year plan. The VDOT 6-year plan includes state, federal, regional money, the WMATA pass-through money that didn't get restored, by the way. It got taken and used for WMATA. The proposal was to raise taxes. It didn't. Just use some of your own money and moved it over to WMATA. That hasn't changed this year yet. But look at the totals, flat, totally flat. So here's the 6-year plan. That's construction in the 6-year plan. Same reason, this is maintenance. Going up, cost of maintenance go up, no more money, it's flat. New construction goes down, and sort of comes out in the wash. The new Smart Scale program, they allocate new construction dollars from Smart Scale. I actually kind of like it, it's a pretty good system. But, you know, it's still contingent on how much money you have. Well, in the second round, 18 localities proposed $8.6 billion in projects. Those projects were ready to go. They're all ready to go projects. So it's a really good needs list on what you guys think is needed. Funded $1 billion, 12% of the requests. The next round, because they capped, they said, wow, we don't want to look at all these requests. They capped the number of requests. Look at my thing out here. They didn't want to see as many requests. So they capped it. And so you still got 7 billion requests in the current round that's being evaluated right now. They expect, this is public information, they're estimating 800 million is going to be available, less than 12% of the capped amount of requests. We've got a transportation problem in the state too. That's still there. We had a temporary Band-Aid put over it in 2013. That was it. So, in summary, it's a year of choices, folks. I've never seen this kind of money. There's a lot of pressures to get it back, a lot of pressures to reserve it. The chances of seeing this kind of revenue again, though, in the near future are not great. And so, do what you can to get your voices heard and what you would like to see happen. That's all I can say. Thank you.